Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Zoom into Wine. It's time for the show and your host, Ian Blackburn.
All right, I'm excited to introduce you to Diana Kelley. Diana is with Vega, Sicilia. How are you today, Diana?
Very well, thank you, Ian. Hello, good evening, everyone.
Are you in the US or in Spain?
So I'm actually based in Mexico City. I'm in charge of covering the export markets, of managing the export markets and representing the brands in the Americas. So I cover Canada all the way down to Argentina, and
Wow.
I'm based in Mexico City. Yes.
Wow, fantastic. Wow. Well, how are things in Mexico City right now?
Well, interesting. Things are opening up, not as fast as in the U.S., unfortunately, but things are looking better this year, which is good. I think
Yeah,
for everyone, I think we're ready to start getting our lives back to what normal is now. But yeah, excited to see that things are opening up.
excellent. Well, I have long admired Vega Sicilia, the reputation, the the consistency of quality has been very high. How long? Tell us about Vega Sicilia. Tell us, when were they established and about the brand itself.
So Vega Sicilia, for those, I'm not sure if all of you are familiar with the name. Vega Sicilia, even though it sounds a little bit Italian, it's actually a Spanish winery that was founded in 1864 in Ribera del Duero, which Ribera del Duero, it's a wine region in Spain that is fairly recent. I mean, it's not one of the most popular wine regions from Spain, but the region itself, recognized as an AOC or as a wine region, was actually given in 1982. And it's a region that's about a 2 hour drive north of Madrid. Vega Sicilia was founded there in 1864. So for more than 100 years, it was pretty much the only winery there. It was actually the only winery for the 70 years prior to actually recognizing Rivera as an actual wine region.
Wow.
And then when the region was founded, there were I think it was about 70 wineries in the region. Nowadays, Ribera del Duero, like I said, it's one of the most well-known wine regions in Spain, and you have over 350 wineries. So the
Hmm.
winery was founded there, and it was actually not founded as a winery. We actually sort of imagine what things were back in 1864. It was actually a sort of a big farm, what we call in Spanish an hacienda, which means you have other things that are going on there, not only wine. The main focus is usually planting other crops, cereals, and maybe potatoes and other things. And vines were actually planted in the part of the farm where nothing else could grow. Right, that's what their mentality or the logic was: is that we should plant just vines where we cannot actually plant cereals or something that we can actually eat, or eventually something to feed cattle or other animals, right? So Vega Sicilia was founded a little bit with that concept, and the founder, which his name was Eloy Lecanda, he actually started bringing some vines from France. So the winery are nowadays, what we do is really tempranillo. That's what you are going to taste tonight. You're going to taste tempranillo, and that's really what we know, and that's really what we do right now, mostly for the most part. But back in the day, there were many varietals planted. Tempranillo was one of them. There was also some other local varietals that are now not really much in use, like Tempranillo Blanco or white Tempranillo as well. And there were some other varietals like Cabernet Sauvignon, which we still use a little bit of, but there was also Petit Verdot, Malbec, Merlot. So Vega Sicilia initially was actually vineyards that were planted with many varietals. And throughout the history, that has changed. But what has actually not changed is sort of the philosophy that Vega Sicilia has. From the beginning, from 1864 when it was founded up until now, what Vega Sicilia is really well known for, it's the aging of its wines. So At the Vega Sicilia winery, we produce 3 wines. 2 of them are actually wines that are harvested. The third one is just a blend of vintages. But we age our wines 5 years, 10 years, or even more before release, and are usually wines that have really long life. So that's really what Vega Sicilia is very well known for. And it's a winery that it's considered an icon in Spain, but also that is considered one of those great terroirs in the world. Nowadays, we are very fortunate for us that love drinking wine, that we have fantastic wine coming from many parts of the world at many different price points. But it's true that wine and very sort of that type of wine that kind of stands out from the rest, it's really related to where it's grown. It's still a product that's very, very attached or linked to the agricultural roots of the product. And for sure, you still have what we were known as the 10 or 15 great terroirs in the world. And Vega Sicilia happens to be recognized as one of those great terroirs in the world. So that's sort of what the story is of Vega Sicilia. And you're going to taste Valbuena Fifth or Valbuena Quinto, which is one of the wines that we produce from Vega Sicilia. And what happened is that throughout the history of Vega Sicilia, the winery changed owners. And in 1982, it was a coincidence that right at the time that the AOC, as I mentioned before, was sort of founded, the Alvarez family purchased Vega Sicilia. And they purchased Vega Sicilia. It was not really because they were particularly interested in going into the wine business. The Alvarez family were not at all in the wine industry. There were already a family that was recognized in Spain because they were in business and mostly in the service industry. But the previous owner, which was the only one that was not Spanish in the history of Vega Sicilia, was a very wealthy Venezuelan businessman. And he purchased Vega Sicilia in the 60s because he tasted Único in New York. He loved the wine and he purchased the winery. And many years later, he actually wanted to give the winery as a wedding present to his son. And his son was really not interested. He was in Venezuela, he was there, he had no interest in going into wine. So his son decides to sell Vega Sicilia, and he reached out to David Alvarez. And David Alvarez started looking a little bit at the numbers and decided that the family wanted to invest and purchase Vega Sicilia with the idea that was a pure investment, the idea of selling the winery maybe in a few years. But David had I say the very good idea of putting one of his 7 children in charge, Pablo. Pablo was a lawyer. He lived in Madrid. If you meet him right now, he's extremely knowledgeable about wine. He loves wine. But at the time, he always says that he knew nothing about wine. He would drink wine at special occasions. He liked wine, but he did not have any interest in going into the wine business either. But his father asked him to please go to Vega Sicilia and to look into that business that the family had just invested in to see what it was. And Pablo started going to Vega Sicilia. He was a lawyer, 30 years old in Madrid. And he started going once a week, to Vega Sicilia to see what was that about. And then he started getting interested by working with who was the manager and a little bit the person that did everything at Vega Sicilia back in the 80s. He started really getting close to him, and he learned a lot. And he started going more often, 2 times a week, 3 times a week. He eventually moved to Valladolid, which is the closest town to where the winery is. And he completely fell in love with Vega Sicilia. And the reason I'm giving you all this background is because the other wine and the first wine you're tasting, which is a León, actually comes from this kind of passion that Pablo developed. And he actually convinced his father and his siblings not to sell Vega Sicilia, to actually not only keep it, but really keep it as something that was going to be very valuable for the family, because it was something very unique, and to start other projects. So nowadays, Vega Sicilia, or how we call the group, is Tempos Vega Sicilia. We have 5 wineries. One winery is Vega Sicilia, but we have 4 other wineries, 3 in Spain and 1 in Hungary, actually. And one of the wineries is a León, which was the first project outside of Vega, Sicilia that the family started, also in Ribera del Duero.
Great story. Great story. And the wines, are considered some of the most collected wines in the world today. But were the wines that good back in the 1980s? I mean, couldn't you, like, from far away see that this was a diamond?
So in the 1980s, Vega Sicilia was not as well known as it is today. Today, we are exported to 150 countries. We are very fortunate because the wine is actually 100% sold through allocation. That means that in Spain, for example, we have a list of direct consumers, clients, that includes private customers, hotels, restaurants, stores. Everyone that wants to buy Vega Sicilia in Spain has to buy it directly from the winery. There's no distribution in Spain. And we have a list of about 3,500 clients, direct clients in Spain. But we have a list that it's, I believe, more than 4,000 people that are on the wait list to buy directly from Vega Sicilia. So that's what happens in Spain. And now we actually have that same concept abroad, but the difference is that we allocate it to different countries. So we allocate the amount of wine that's available for the US, for other European countries, for maybe China, for other, etc. So in the 1980s, this system was going on, except that Vega Sicilia was definitely not exported to 150 countries, but it was already a very recognized wine, especially in Spain. Now, one of the things that Vega Sicilia has kept throughout the history, like I mentioned in the beginning, is sort of the aging process of the wine. So in 1982, it was already a winery, not only that it was recognized, but the wines were extremely approachable and drinkable. A lot of people, I have this question that, you know how Bordeaux back in the day were wines that when they were released were very difficult to drink. So that's why they were actually put down and cellared for a little bit longer, because they actually, let's say, became the Bordeaux that were so fantastic years after in bottle.
And that's a 2005. And tell us about that wine.
So Allion, it's the first project that the family started outside of Vega Sicilia. This project started in the early 1990s. So still, Ribera del Duero was a very young wine region, or a recognized wine region as an AOC. So there was still possibility of sourcing grapes and getting something interesting. And the family had the idea, or Pablo had the idea actually, of having a more modern version of Vega Sicilia. And by modern, I mean a wine that was a monovarietal. So a wine that was only going to be Tempranillo or Tinto Fino, the name that we give to Tempranillo or to the clone of Tempranillo from Ribera del Duero. And it was only going to be 3 years of aging. So it was going to be a shorter aging, it was going to be a monovarietal, and it was going to be aged in 100% new French oak. So it was going to be a more, like I said, modern, younger version. So the thing that happened with Allion is that it actually became a sort of flagship wine for the region. And nowadays, it's not considered a modern version of Ribera del Duero. It's considered sort of a Ribera del Duero wine nowadays. The wine, actually, the winery itself, it's like 7 miles from the Vega Sicilia winery. It's extremely close. And what happened here is that we used to produce a third wine in Vega Sicilia that was called Valbuena Third. And the grapes that were used for Valbuena Third actually have been going to Allion ever since. So we stopped producing Valbuena Third. I think the last vintage was 1988. And all those grapes are now part of Allion. They make up 50% of the wine. So 50% of the grapes of Allion come from the Vega Sicilia estate, from the vineyards that are closer to the Duero River. And the other 50% of the grapes are actually grapes that we source from a little bit throughout the Ribera del Duero region. So we source it to other farmers. So these are in the majority, these are not vineyards that Vega Sicilia or the family owns. These are agreements that were made with the farmers back in the day that we still keep up to date. with the possibility that if they eventually want to sell, Vega Sicilia, of course, will purchase them. But if not, we have been working with them for many years already. We work very well. Vega Sicilia monitors and follows up in every single part of the process, from planting to all the way to growing, the whole growing cycle and everything. And what's interesting is that Ribera del Duero as a region, and then we start doing the aging and doing the blending. And we believe that really adds to the complexity of the wine, because there's Vega Sicilia has the philosophy that this attention to detail and actually being able to vinify and understand every single sub-region actually helps give some extra layers to the final wine. So ever since the beginning, since 1991, which was the first vintage of Allion is still to date 100% Tinto Fino. So it's still 100% Tempranillo from Ribera del Duero. Up until the 2015 vintage, it was a wine that was aged for 12 months in new French oak and 2 years in bottle. That was Allion. It was very simple, very straightforward, and you had that, let's say, you had a very different profile than what you get from the Vega Sicilia wines. And you will see that very now, because it's interesting to see that you will have the Tempranillo from Allion, and then you'll have the Tempranillo from Valbuena. You'll see that Allion, it's a lot more straightforward. It's a wine that it's usually very generous. It is very well integrated, but it tends to be very generous, especially in warm vintages. The only difference that you will have in the 2016, that we think it's sort of a milestone vintage for us, is that Gonzalo, our head winemaker, a little bit reading a little bit how we were getting vintages in, he decided to introduce concrete vats to the aging. So we do 90% mostly new French oak, like we did past almost 30 years. So 2016, we think it's a milestone vintage for us because of that switch in the aging that had been done for many years, and also because we believe it's a very it was a successful move for Gonzalo and the team in that way. I mean, you'll tell me, you're going to taste it now.
Yeah, well, I've been dying to taste it up until this point. The wine has got an amazing score pedigree, and the reputation of the brand precedes it hitting my glass. We didn't set this up after tasting the wines. I set this up first, and then we worked on getting the wines, and so we're really excited to be able to taste this wine together. Thank you. Now let's talk about the star of our show tonight, which is the 2015. That's the Bodega Vega Sicilia Valbuena 5 Año or Cinco Año. Yeah, do I okay on my Spanish?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, and this wine represents a single vintage, but the house also makes a wine that's a blend of vintages, correct?
Yes. So at the Vega Sicilia winery, we produce Valbuena 5th or Valbuena Quinto Año, which is the wine we're tasting. We produce Único, which is a wine that is, I'll explain you a little bit the process, but it's a wine that's aged 10 years at least before being released. No problem.
Well, so the 15, if you were to create a hierarchy, I'm assuming that the price kind of helps establish that a little bit, but between the three wines, you release this one, and then you release the Único when it's 10 years old, and you release the Reserva when it's ready. Yeah.
Yeah. So what happens is that we have our vineyards in the farm, and the Alvarez family, when they got the winery, they decided to invest in actually understanding the vineyard, because eventually that's really the patrimony that the family has. The winery has actually live for 150 years. The idea is for it to actually live 150 years. So the most important thing was to actually be able to understand the vineyards and how to manage them to be able to preserve them for the future generations. So they invested a lot in that. And they mapped out the whole vineyards, and they mapped it out. And that we have now 52 different plots in the vineyard, 19 different types of soils. Every single plot, so 52 different plots, every single plots get harvested individually and vinified individually. That means that in our cellar, we actually have 52 fermenting tanks, because everything gets vinified by plot. And the first stage of the aging process, it's similar for Valbuena and Unico. They go into barrels, the size that we know, the 225-liter barrels, French oak and American oak, so both about 50-50 approximately. This vintage that you have, it's about a 95% Tinto Fino, 5% Merlot in the blend. So from that sort of mix of varietals that we had in the vineyard, we had obviously to start replanting. And when we started replanting, the way we do it is we use our own genetic materials. So we replant our own vines, we clone them, and we replant our own vines.
Sure.
And when
Picking the best ones.
And when we started doing that, it was, they just figured out that really what was working best was planting Tempranillo. Merlot, it works good in a small percentage, and we still keep Cabernet Sauvignon. But for example, for Valbuena, up until the 2008 vintage, we still had a little bit of Malbec in the blend. So not too many years ago, there was still some Malbec used for Valbuena. But the problem is that when we tried to replant it, it just was not working. The quality of the grapes that we were getting from those younger vines was in no way getting the quality that we had from those older vines. We were getting too much alcohol, not too much acidity. It was just not the quality of fruit that we wanted. So we decided to stop Malbec and focus on what really works, which is Tinto Fino, Tempranillo, with the very simple idea that the better the grapes you put into the wine, the better the wine is always going to be.
Understood. Yeah, that's fascinating and exciting at the same time. In a blind tasting, there's 3 wines presented in front of you, and you know that one of them is from Vega, Sicilia. What is going to make that wine stand out? What are you going to be looking for to determine which one is Vega, Sicilia?
Oh, that's a very good question. I would say it's, in part, it would be obviously the experience of sort of, tasting the wines by the nose. I would say specifically, if I know where they're coming from, if I know it's Ribera del Duero, I believe it's relatively easy, because both Valbuena and Unico are a little bit outside of the normal profile that you get from Ribera del Duero, in the sense that sometimes you think that as you go up in, I don't know, either in price or in quality in the wines, you're gaining in intensity. And it's not really the case. With Valbuena and Unico, you do not gain in intensity. Actually, I do believe Aldeon is much more intense than Valbuena. You gain a lot in elegance, and the wines actually become, let's say, it's not expressive. They become less powerful in a way, less, and they gain a lot more in layers and complexity. So Valbuena is going to be a wine that when you taste it, you will have some fruit, but it's not going to be fruit that's kind of in your face and right away. You will eventually start getting some fruit. And as the wine kind of sits in your glass, it's going to start opening up, and you're going to see many layers to it, but nothing is going to extremely stand out. You're not going to sense the oak. You're not going to sense the fruit. It's a wine that is going to be very difficult to pull apart, because it's going to be so integrated that you're not going to get, oh, I get, the sort of the toast and the vanilla and the oak notes. Oh, and I get, the berries and the warm fruit on the side. Like sometimes you can get in younger wines or in more, expressive, more powerful versions of Tempranillo. With both Valbuena and Unico, I think that they are wines that they're slowly start opening up, but nothing really pops out. Everything is so integrated that you get a very complex nose as a whole. And like I said, if knowing it's coming from Ribera del Duero, I think the fact that the wines are so elegant, and sometimes I'm not sure it's the right descriptor, but it's lighter in style in a way. It's not a heavy style of Ribera del Duero. It's a very sort of more balanced, light style of Ribera del Duero.
You came from a past of, it looks like your academic background. You had both a degree in food science and engineering.
Yes.
That's an interesting combination.
Yes.
What did you have in mind when you took those two degrees?
Well, it's actually one degree. It's food science, but also you have to take in the engineering part, because it's how do you transform the food into what we know nowadays as the packaged, or even the food that you eat in restaurants. Everything, it's engineered so that it's available to us. Yeah.
Aha.
Which
Very
is
good. And then
a very fun degree, but obviously afterwards, the actual, I guess, yeah, it's very fun to learn it, but then when you have to put it into practice, it's not as fun as learning how to do it, obviously.
And what led you into wine? You went to work for Pernod Ricard, and it looks like you even lived in Paris for a while.
So I had the opportunity to do a study abroad program when I was doing my food science and engineering studies. And I decided to go to France because that was an option and I could learn French. And when I got there, studying food science in France, it's very linked to agriculture, extremely linked to agriculture. So the university I was at had many different options, and one of the options was wine, obviously, because it's such a big part of the French culture and French agriculture. And because we didn't really have that, we didn't really go into detail in my studies back home. I decided to do that just to learn something different, and I really, really enjoyed studying viticulture and enology. And I decided then later to do my master's in France in enology and viticulture. And that's why I stayed in Paris for a few years after working there.
Sounds like a good plan to me. Well, it's been fascinating talking to you, and we thank you for enriching us on the history of the brand and the products that we're about to taste. And thank you very much for giving us this time.
Thank you so much, Ian, and thank you, everyone. I really hope you enjoy the wines. And yeah, please do give me your comments afterwards to see what everyone thought about both. Which one did they prefer for drinking now, and maybe from drinking later?
All right, so we're going to ask that question tonight. Which one did you prefer for drinking now and drinking later? And when you come to Los Angeles, make sure you come say hi. Maybe we can even do something a little grander in person.
Of course. I'd love the opportunity. Thank you so much for giving us the space and for giving us the opportunity to show our wines.